gentlemen, welcome. Thank you very much for being here. Gregor, I'd like to start with you. AIIB's operating in some 40 countries. Infrastructure is what you do. Have you seen any movements, any improvement in unlocking private capital to fund some of these projects?
Well, we've certainly seen improvement in the process. I was reflecting as Sir Danny was just talking about process for allocating capital on projects, about our first infrastructure project that was a private-public partnership project in China, which was in about 1982. And it was Gordon Wu, who was a Hong Kong-based entrepreneur, who was the sponsor. And Gordon's method for assessing the investability was, would his wife be prepared to pay a toll to drive on a highway from Shenzhen to Guangzhou? And he decided she would, and then on that basis alone went ahead with the project. Processes have improved markedly since then. But it seems to me that what we need to do is move away from a project-by-project model in order to have any chance of filling this gap, whether it's 1.7 trillion. The general thinking is about half of that is doable by public sector and MDBs, and the other half needs to be the private sector. Two things about that. Number one, we say infrastructure and call it a thing, but actually infrastructure is a lot of different things. As defined by AIIB, it ranges from telecoms, which is a term that's going to go out of date pretty soon, probably already is, to sanitation and transport and power in between. And the gap is very different in the different sectors. So the telecom part is easy. It's largely private sector, and between that and power is really where the private sector activity is, and it's still struggling in transport and almost nowhere in water and sanitation. So we need to focus on transport and water and sanitation. And it seems to me that in order to do that, we need a strategic plan. Each country should have a strategic plan. The Chinese themselves, of course, have a strategic plan, and it's been very much in recent 5-year planning cycles about infrastructure in order to stimulate economic and social development. And it seems to me that AIIB would be very well positioned to be able to even require its member countries to develop their own strategic plans so that it's understood what the priorities are for their infrastructure and how it all fits together. If we try and build it up on a project-by-project basis, my fear is we'll never get there, and we certainly won't get there in a way that's, clean, green, and lean. So that's what I would recommend.
Thank you very much. We will come to Sir Daniel. That's a good point about strategic planning and whether it should be a requirement for members. But Daniel, let me turn to you now. How do you match private capital with this infrastructure? What work is Standard Chartered doing, and how are you finding this, what seems to be an unassailable hill?
No, thank you. Maybe as a bank that's based predominantly in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, that does 90% of its business in those regions, and particularly in Asia, and one of the largest involved in project finance. I think we really welcome the creation of AIIB and this focus that Asia House and others have on bridging this gap between private capital and infrastructure financing. And in some ways, this is a bit of a paradox because I think, as you mentioned, if you look at the amount of capital out there in the private sector, forget the total aggregate amount. Let's just look at the amount that's currently invested in negative yielding assets, which is about $8.6 trillion worth. And you speak to investors, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, they're all saying we need better yielding, good structured, good assets to invest into. And then on the other side, when I speak to a lot of ministers of finance and governments about how do you finance projects, they say, well, we have tons of projects, but we can't get the financing. So on the one hand, you've got a lot of capital. On the other hand, you seem to have a lot of projects, and never the twain are sort of really meeting. And I think we've touched on some of those issues because it is a very complex situation. And I think what's making it actually more complicated is the two traditional solutions to bridging that gap, namely the banking sector and I think the multilaterals, have come under increasing strain over a period of time. So for the banking sector, and if you look at someone like Standard Chartered, we're involved in helping make a project bankable, structuring it, monitoring it, and then bringing in others to take on that risk. But with the changing Basel regulation, banks themselves are becoming increasingly penalised in holding long-term project finance type assets. At the same time, we've seen this, whether it's 1.7 trillion or the 13 trillion that's required to meet the Paris climate targets. The need is growing, but the actual amount of sort of development money in terms of the banks, notwithstanding AIIB and NDB, is relatively capped at sort of 160 trillion. So those two routes are not enough. And so I think it's going to be about how we create this partnership across both the private and public sector, and particularly for me, the partnership across commercial banks who are very active in infrastructure financing and institutions like the AIIB in finding these new solutions.
Okay, thanks very much. Matt, let me turn to you now. There's the role of the banks, but there's also the role of the long-term investors. How is Pru working with AIIB and other multilateral development banks to generate interest and to enable some of those funds to flow into projects?
Thank you, Michael. I mean, I very much agree with what Daniel just said. We all know there is the gap. There is no shortage of money. There is a lot of money that insurers, pension funds have got that they would very much like to have in these kinds of assets. We have very long-term liabilities, 10, 20, 30 years. We would love to match those with long-term assets with steady, usually inflation-linked yields. So, and the other thing is it is happening. There is, Prudential's a big investor in infrastructure in the UK, whether that's sort of the traditional infrastructure like energy or newer categories like broadband. So it is happening, and it's happening to an extent in Asia. We're funding power plants in ASEAN and India, for example, but nowhere near on the scale that would meet that would close the gap that we're all talking about. I mean, so could we do more? Absolutely, the money is there. We would love to do more. Why isn't it happening? I mean, I would agree with the way that Danny set it out in his speech in terms of what are the areas we need to think about. We need to think about the pipeline of investable projects. We need to think about how governments, multilateral organisations, and business can manage policy risk. It's our job to manage commercial risk. It's up to us to work out whether there's going to be a need for this in 10, 20 years or whatever. What we find difficult or off-putting is the possibility of a 180-degree change in policy on some area of energy and so on. And the involvement of organisations like the AIIB or others can really help us with that. So there's the pipeline, there's policy risk, but there is also regulation. And I think I'd slightly take issue with Danny when he said he thinks that the UK's pretty much sorted that. I don't think the UK insurance sector would agree. A lot of aspects of the UK regulatory framework which don't encourage us to invest in infrastructure, but also in parts of Asia. There are countries where it's outright forbidden for life insurers to invest in infrastructure. There are others where regulation more indirectly discourages and penalises it. And so, that's I'm happy to say more about that. I know insurance regulation isn't the most exciting subject, but that's key. We will get to regulation because it is clearly a barrier to unlocking funds, private capital, to go into infrastructure. So we will come back to that. David, let me now turn to you. We talked about capital, unlocking capital, but what else can the private sector bring to the party in terms of trying to meet this need?
I think capital filling a gap to 1.7 trillion. I give an answer a bit like the Godfather. If filling 800 billion of capital gap is merely capital, then oh salute. I think it's a massive contribution. But the reason that London can, and the United Kingdom, let's face it, financial services and professional services, 25% of our economy, and the Prudentials, the HSBCs, the Standard Chartereds are not bringing their own capital. They're bringing funds that others trust them to use well. And the reasons why they're trusted to do it, to use them well, is because we're used to investing, and have been for centuries, people's money in projects which are subject to a rule of law that people understand, with dispute resolution which is fair and proportionate, with proper feasibility studies of infrastructure investments, with people like Mott MacDonald and Arup really making sure that infrastructure is appropriate, meets standards, and actually will work for users. Making these projects commercial, I think, is really important. You know, one of the big questions about Belton Road, and we've heard a lot about that in the last week, and Eurasian infrastructure is how much of this is strategic investment by government and how much of it is commercial. And actually, I think an awful lot of governments would really value private sector involvement to make sure more of it is commercial. You know, I used to work quite closely with Sir Brian Pittman at Lloyds Banking Group. One of his expressions was, anytime anybody mentions the word strategy, I'm going to reach for my gun. An awful lot of these projects, if they're not well managed, are going to turn out to be strategic projects, bridges from nowhere in particular to nowhere in particular, which nobody's using because they weren't properly evaluated in the first place. So the reason that London can bring, and the UK can bring so much more than capital, is because over many years we've evolved the firms and the skills to evaluate projects and make sure they're truly viable.
I'd like to bring Sir Danny in now on a couple of points there. Gregory's point about strategic plans and countries, possibly your member countries being required to have a strategic plan for infrastructure. Is that on your agenda? Is that feasible?
Thank you, and thank you to the panel for the comments. And I think there's a lot of very useful stuff in there. And just to pick up Matt's point, I certainly didn't say that everything in the UK was perfect. I was referring to some of the steps that we took during my time in office, which I hope moved things in the right direction, at least. So obviously our bank engages in strategic dialogues with member countries to understand what their plans are, and to work out within that what are the areas where AIIB involvement might be appropriate and might not be appropriate. At the moment, our conditions are very much on a project-by-project basis, looking at issues about project quality, issues about the safeguards around projects, and so forth. Whilst there are clearly a lot of benefits to countries to developing a plan, I'm not sure it's something it's really appropriate necessarily for a multilateral to require to get financing. That's not the way our institution was set up. But I think that playing a role in sharing knowledge and experience and helping to ensure that the benefits that countries that have good planning frameworks achieve from those benefits, I think is something which is useful, which I think there are other institutions that do. I'm sure the AIIB could play a role in that. So I think not a requirement, but sharing information, sharing best practice, helping to demonstrate that you know, having a national infrastructure plan or equivalent and being able to look a long way ahead in terms of the sorts of things you're trying to do, and as David was saying, having a framework that ensures that it's well justified in terms of project assessment, economic benefits, and so on. It's clearly something that has advantages, and sharing those advantages, I think, is a useful thing for MDBs and international organisations to be involved in.
Just following up Matt's point, though, on policy risk, because that is a big issue. Are the policies going right, or are they going to change when there's a change of government? Does the AIIB see itself as playing a role in advising governments on ensuring that there's minimum risk to policy shifts which will affect long-term investments?
Well, it's certainly something that we look at when we're assessing. Do we invest in a project? You know, we look at those questions, of course, and discuss them with project sponsors. But I think it's also an area where having a multilateral development bank like the AIIB involved in a project with the close relationships that we must have with the governments of our member countries, that's something in itself which helps to give some confidence to private sector investments. That kind of political risk insurance, if you like, that comes from an MDB involvement is one area where I think multilaterals can play a very beneficial role.
Thanks. Very much welcome your questions, your comments. If you're interested in getting on, please just stick your hand in the air and we'll bring a microphone around to you. But Gregory, let me come back to you. The political risk component of infrastructure. Do organisations like the AIIB give Arab confidence to get into a project, or is there more that they need to do to speed up the process?
Yeah, no, very much so. And, you know, any of the, it's good to have any of the MDBs involved in projects, you know, World Bank, Asian Development Bank, AIIB. And as Danny said earlier, they all work to very similar kinds of protocols. I would say that they have different degrees of bureaucracy, and some of that bureaucracy, while well-intended, is not always helpful, you know, by way of treacle. So I very much support the lean part of AIIB. It is very helpful. They do bring international standards. They give a certain amount of confidence. And we've found, you know, in a practical way on the ground, we've found that they also keep low-level politics and even corruption, which I'm very sad to say is alive and well in the infrastructure world across the entire world, some countries more than others. The involvement of the MDBs keeps that somewhat at bay, and that can only be a good thing, because this sort of, you know, one of the barriers to infrastructure investment is the degree of transparency, you know, not to say corruption on the other side of that, in certain countries. And where that exists, very difficult for private sector to engage at any kind of serious level. And those who do, you have to be suspicious about their mode of operation. So this is something that really does need to be driven out of the industry. I know that AIIB are taking, you know, that very seriously, and I applaud it, and I think that's very helpful.
Okay, Daniel, you must find that, I assume, you're Standard Chartered, huge project finance operators in the region. That transparency issue, is it still an issue? Is it going away? Is it improving?
I mean, I think, let me echo a lot of what Gregory said there. I think particularly around the involvement of multilaterals like the AIIB and others in terms of giving assurance, obviously to ourselves, but also to any investors that we would work to bring into a project as well. And maybe just stepping back from that, I mean, I think we probably work with, you know, we're probably one of the biggest partners of the multilaterals, and we certainly aspire to be one of the biggest for AIIB going forward. And I think there are broadly three areas where I think they play an incredibly important role. I really like Danny's typology, but maybe let me offer three C's, if you like. I think the first one is around coordination, because actually, from the point of view of an investor coming in or a bank, it can actually be quite difficult to get information about a particular project or getting clarity around situations, or you may have a lot of individual issues that Gregory's touched on. From the government's perspective, it's actually equally bewildering in terms of how do you get project preparation funds, which investors to go to, which banks to involve. And there's kind of a very powerful coordination role that multilaterals can play. The second one is around creating. And I think to pick up Gregory's point, infrastructure, it's a very easy phrase to talk about, but actually it's very complex underneath it. And within that, there are different risks that the private sector and the public sector can take. And in each different asset class, that is very different. So you've got certain asset classes, telecom's a great example, where the private sector can almost do it entirely. You've got others like health, for example, where there isn't really a great role for the private sector on its own without a big public sector. And so being able to create a market, I think, is really important. And Danny touched on a sector view, and I think that I would very much encourage, because infrastructure is so complicated. Unless you get down to the individual sector and individual country, you can't unpick why it's not happening. The third one then is to catalyse, and that's where I think actually creating opportunities for the private sector to come in and to crowd in private capital becomes really key. And for us, the big advantage for the multilaterals is the use of guarantees, because there you get cover, it provides assurance, it provides a halo effect, but it also then allows the private sector to come in underneath that. And I think Danny's touched on elsewhere the importance of developing a guarantee product within the AIIB. I think that would be really, really useful. If I can add a final C, which is currency, it hasn't been talked about yet, but I think the big challenge for infrastructure to really move the needle is we need to move away from just dollar financing. It's very easy to finance a project that has dollar offtake. how do we solve for local currency? Because actually the big capital pools are in foreign currency, but the big infrastructure needs are in local currency. And there I think there is a real market failure that someone like AIIB could take a real leadership position on.
Okay. We will bring Stephanie into that, but Matt, let me turn to you. You mentioned policy risk and political risk in projects. How can the PRU and other big investors work with AIIB to minimise that risk, to shift policy? How active can you be and what can you actually achieve, again, to unlock private capital, if that is the game?
Thanks. I mean, well, I'd echo a lot of what Daniel has just said. And I mean, it's obviously not just AIIB, others are active in this space. Prudential earlier this year committed $500 million to a fund with the World Bank, with the IFC, part of the World Bank Group, which is addressing exactly the same set of issues. And again, it's using, they're providing an element of guarantee as well as the confidence that comes with working alongside a multilateral organisation. So we don't see that as a sort of a competitor or rival to AIIB. We think, as we've all said, the scale of the gap and the playing field is so large that there's space for all of these. It's about making sure that any new organisation, any new amount of money that comes in is really being additional, is really getting stuff funded, getting projects off the ground that wouldn't otherwise have happened. Potentially over the longer term, I think organisations like the World Bank and the AIIB can play a role in talking to governments, regulators about how to, about why the money isn't coming through faster. I think they can. That probably will be a longer term challenge. But it would definitely help us, for someone other than us, to be going to regulators saying, look, you really need to look at some of these aspects of regulation if you really want to unlock some of this capital.
Okay. Development of capital markets, local capital markets, is clearly part of the equation. Does that put the City of London at risk in a sense? Because that's one of the things London brings to the party.
I'd answer that entirely differently. I think that the reason the city is so successful is it doesn't have sharp elbows. It's about cooperating wherever it should cooperate in the interests of investors. The clue is HSBC, global headquarters here. Does it have anything to do with Hong Kong? Well, it's in the name, Standard Chartered too. This is not about a competition between London, Hong Kong, Almaty, if Almaty is built. I think London can do a huge amount to work with other centres like Dubai, helping to provide funding, dollar clearing, derivatives, making this work in a seamless way. If we're in competition with anybody, it's New York rather than financial centres being built through Central Asia, which could play a real role in providing a secure home for the savings of those, we hope, increasingly prosperous countries. But it's working with rather than against.
So Danny, can I bring you back in here? Daniel mentioned the 4 Cs, and it's the 4th C, the currency, that I want to touch on. Local currency financing of this project. What's the view of the AIIB, and can you accelerate a move to allow local currency financing of infrastructure projects?
If at first I may just comment on what Gregory said about
Sure.
about standards and anti-corruption. I want to underscore the importance of what he said and of the very tough approach that the AIIB takes on those matters. In keeping with other multilaterals, we have very high standards. We do a lot of due diligence, of course, on projects and then monitoring thereafter. And we've already unilaterally adopted a policy which means that if a company is debarred by one multilateral because of engagement in corruption or other things, they will automatically be debarred by the AIIB. So there is a list of more than 1,000 entities that the AIIB is already debarred from working with us because they've been found to engage in corrupt practices by other institutions. And we expect to develop that further. You can find all the information on that and our policies in that area on the website. So that's the clean part of the lean, clean and green. On the currency point, absolutely recognise the importance and the appetite for being able to deliver local currency financing. we're still in the business of building up our financial infrastructure within our bank, but very much we intend that we'll be able to offer local currency financing as well as financing in US dollars or other convertible currencies in the coming years. And certainly that's what we hear a lot from our members, that they want to be able to raise funds in local currencies, and we want to be able to help to support that, and we will be able to, but we're not quite there yet, just in terms of the kind of startup phase in our institution. I just wanted to pick up something else that was mentioned, and maybe I think there may even be a question in this for the panel, because part of the challenge seems to be the different risk appetites that different sorts of institutions have, where banks are very willing to take the early stage construction risks, but perhaps are more constrained by regulation. Insurance companies, when a project is completed and it's starting to earn revenues and there's a stable arrangement over several decades, potentially it's very interesting, but taking the construction risk is not part of your risk appetite in any big way. Maybe it is, you can talk about that. But it seems to me that there's a role for institutions like ours in helping to manage that translation of risk from one stage to the other. And observations that panelists have on how MDBs can help in that respect, I think would be interesting. So I think that the step from shorter term financing that's willing to take construction risk to longer term financing that wants long, steady returns is a missing piece in the jigsaw.
Let's get the view from each of the panelists on this.
Yeah, so on that, I'll go back to my first point. I really do think it's important that there is a strategy for infrastructure. Infrastructure is, by definition, political, because there are winners and losers. And where does political influence become corrupt is a very, I'll support your bridge to nowhere if you support my, whatever it is a very interesting question. And unfortunately, there's too much of it around. And in this world where, notwithstanding what my financial friends say here, where there's scarcity of capital in relation to the need, we can't afford that to happen. There needs to be properly strategically planned infrastructure. I mean, China's done it. And the reason I would submit to you that China's been as successful economically as it has is because of its 5-year planning cycle, which started with infrastructure investing. Xi Jinping and I have two things in common. We're both engineers, and we're both about the same age, and those are the only two things. But the engineering part is very important. So I'll go back and say, I do think the MDBs, and I wouldn't pick on AIIB alone. I do think the MDBs would do the world, frankly, a great service by encouraging strategic planning for infrastructure to occur, so that then investment can be done on a much more transparent basis, and the private sector can do what the private sector can do and move on through stages and recycle the capital and so on and so forth. But you've got to start with a proper strategy. If you don't have that,
Okay. Transition of risk and the risk action.
Well, let me first pick up on what Gregory said. So there's obviously a distinction between non-bankable projects and bankable projects, and there's a big issue around how do we get projects bankable, and that requires strategy, that requires no corruption, limited political risk, no policy risk, etc., etc. So let's assume the project is bankable at the outset, and to pick up onto Danny's point then about transfer risk, and I completely agree. But it's not just the construction risk. I think that gets talked about a lot, and it's absolutely true. That I think commercial banks, investment banks, are one of the few institutions that really understand that, have developed a track record in that. There are other impediments. I'm interested in what Matt says. I mean, others are things like size. So a big investor probably doesn't want to spend less than $100 million on an individual project and doesn't want to be over 10 to 15 to 20% in any project. There's a limited number of projects where that would kind of work. The other may be the actual rating of the project. So a situational country or a project, again, a lot of investors will not go below investment grade. And I think there is a huge role here for some really innovative ideas around how investment banks, commercial banks, and the multilaterals can work together. Because, for example, if you allow the banks to do the construction risk, and then in some ways allow them then to distribute to people like the pension funds through a credit enhancement that's laid on top of that, that gets you to that rating, allows a bundle of different assets to be put together, you get to that scale issue. So I think it's about how do we start mixing and matching some of the products that are already there but putting it into a bit more of a programmatic approach, and then creating, I think, which has been touched on before, a little bit more of an asset class rather than a bespoke situation for every single project that comes up.
So you're talking about the creation of new instruments, bundling infrastructure projects which meet a certain standard to unlock capital and recycle capital along the timeline of the project.
Yeah, I think that's exactly, it's one option of many. I think it's how do the investment banks, commercial banks, to Gregory's phrase, sit down and have a strategy about how do we use what we're good at, how do we use what multilaterals are good at, and then how do we then mobilise a lot more capital that's currently sitting on the sidelines.
Okay, Matt, bring you in.
Yeah, I mean, the answer is insurers do both. They do some early stage financing and they do later long-term financing. At the early stage, it is limited. It is limited by, I mean, we're an insurance long-term savings company. It's our customers' money. They don't expect us to be taking massive risk. But within a very big, diversified portfolio, it is possible to do that. And so we've got, projects in the UK like the even at a very early stage, like the Swansea Bay Tidal Lagoon, for example. We were the cornerstone investor in that, broadband, so energy projects and so on. But then we've got probably a bigger appetite, as I've said, for buying the assets at a later stage when the yields are more certain and there's less risk. But there are regulatory problems at both stages. So at the early stage, one of the typical problems is, for it to qualify for us to be allowed to invest in it, it has to have fixed income stream. But actually, if you're investing at an early stage, it's not going to have that, and so that isn't allowed to qualify. Sometimes you can get around that by working with the banks to structure the deal, and we have done that, but you can't always do that. And at the later stage, it's often more just about the capital weights that are attached to us investing in infrastructure projects, the risk judgments that the regulators make, and we think if you take a long-term view of the risk of these projects, they're not always justified. So the answer is it can do both. I mean, absolutely, working with banks and others so that they can take more of the risk at an early stage and we can then take it on when it's, that is definitely a really important part of making sure that the different parts of the financial system are working to fill the gap and drive growth.
So, David.
I think this is a really useful discussion because I think what we're demonstrating is that the private sector and the funds that are available globally to be channeled towards Eurasian infrastructure are immense and can act as a real multiplier to the investment that states are making in necessary infrastructure. What we're talking about now is how that multiplier can be made truly efficient. And I think part of that is real transparency, which Danny talked about, that if we're talking about strategic projects, the strategy should be to look at that pool of projects and involve at the earliest possible stage major funding organisations and banks, because you then are identifying projects that will be financeable through development to a greater or lesser extent by the private sector and will be actually investable at a later stage, that they're designed to standards that global fund managers can recognise, that where it says green, it truly is green to a standard that a green investment fund would recognise. And AIIB can play a terrific role in that. But it is about transparency, early stage involvement, and the more that can happen, the more private funding can be channeled into Eurasian infrastructure.
Let's open up now to questions, please. Very keen if you just stick your hand in the air and we'll bring around a microphone for the gentleman just there.
Paul Tweedale from Tenbrook. We have a particular interest in two parts in Asia, Bangladesh and Sri Lanka. So I'm interested in terms of the panel's views on this whole question of bankable deals, given that both countries do not have a great deal amount of money to invest in infrastructure. Both are sub-investment grade. and there is a certain amount of corruption and that side of things in terms of the scale. I mean, we're seeking solutions to some of these because some of the infrastructure projects that are being shown to us will have a significant effect on those countries' abilities to trade their way out of poverty. But we find, in the areas of, say, for instance, UK government support on these things is pretty lacking. We find the aid agencies are not interested in commercial projects, whereas they could play a significant role in terms of making these things bankable. So I'm really looking for some sort of commentary, in terms of how do we actually help some of these countries trade their way out of the problems that they have, as opposed to just writing them checks to no sort of significant effect.
Greg, let me start with you. This comes down partly to, international standards, the bankability of projects, but also the corruption issues. So how can you work in Bangladesh or Sri Lanka unless you're absolutely sure that the projects are clean, transparent?
Yeah, well, I suppose I shouldn't try and dodge the question. Those are two very difficult countries to work in, and our work that's been successful in them to any degree has been work either with an MDB or with a sovereign investor, with an investor with a sovereign entity behind it. So the Chinese or the Japanese, and I must say it's kind of off-piste a little bit, but probably our biggest work in Bangladesh in recent times, apart from the Chinese infrastructure investment, has been for the ILO and related entities trying to make the ready-made garment industry less than a kind of slave industry so that workers are safe in their places of work. It's a small drop in the ocean. Those countries are not high on my list of priorities because although the human need is enormous, the difficulties that you allude to are there, and hopefully AIIB and sovereign investors might get behind it and make a difference. I know there are large capital projects in both countries being sponsored by China. One would hope that they have the effect that you're asking for.
Daniel?
So Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, two important markets for Standard Chartered. We're on the ground in both of those and actually very active. And I think they're both very good examples of where a combination of commercial investment banking and multilaterals and other development agencies can have a really powerful effect. I can give you a couple of examples actually from Africa, which in some respects many investors will see as even more frontier, where you've seen a very successful way to get around some of the issues that you touched on. The World Bank have something called the Scaling Solar Program, where effectively they've tried to create a platform in which private sector can come in on solar projects. And they've done that by, giving a lot of technical assistance to get the regulatory systems up, providing a lot of capacity building to sort of tie off any issues around corruption and policy risk, and then providing a backstop guarantee on the risks that the private sector frankly can't take, things like political risk, things like policy risk. Once they've created that, they then encourage the government to basically auction off a whole set of tariffs on solar power. And that allowed the private sector to come in, assess the risks, understand the risks that they could take, mainly around sort of business operations and delivery, and then actually commit capital. And it was so successful that it actually drove the price of solar down to, I think it was 6 kilowatts per hour was the cheapest that they managed to achieve. A huge saving in terms of energy building. And I see that as a really strong model for frontier markets, where effectively you can combine the multilaterals' appetite for certain risks, work out what they're prepared to do, and then crowd in the commercial sector and allow them to do the things that they're best for. And that requires, I think, that strategic approach at a sector level to say this is how that could work. And I think with that kind of model, and I think I was encouraged that Danny was thinking along those lines in terms of sectors, I think actually you could have a very powerful multiplying effect.
It also needs policy change, doesn't it? Or there's a policy component to those sorts of projects.
Yeah, I mean, Prudential we don't currently operate in either Bangladesh or Sri Lanka. It does. I mean, one of the things is in other frontier markets where we do operate, including in Africa as well. There is a process. There is a process you have to go through. You have to develop the whole capital market, and typically direct infrastructure investment by companies like ours will come some way down after. You've got to develop a bond market, and we've worked with governments like Vietnam to do that, developing long-term bonds, and then the stock market, and then the capital market, and this will take time, but there are good examples of countries who have moved through it reasonably quickly, and if I were those countries that you're talking about, I would be looking around for countries who've done it and made a success of it, and happy to share the lessons.
Okay.
Well, I'm not sure how much I can add to what the other three panelists have said, because I agree with all of it. I think the MDBs have a huge role in countries like this to really help them to understand what standards are required, to have the power to demand those standards are executed. You're building infrastructure which will create circumstances in which there is more potential for private investment. There are things we can do in countries like that. I mean, for example, China-Pakistan economic corridor. I've got a team working to put clean water into 25,000 villages, which is, these are government projects, but how do you project manage as you put infrastructure, transport infrastructure, pipelines in, that the villages along the route are getting something out of it? That there are things we can do, but the truth is they're not commercial propositions at the moment because of the corruption, because of the lack of finance. This is about kick-starting those countries, and the more they see other countries which meet standards, accelerating their growth, doing what China has done, lifting a country out of poverty by its own bootstraps, using infrastructure and using it well. People talk a lot about China's strategic intent. Their infrastructure does work, as anybody who goes through Beijing Airport knows. They proved they're really good at building infrastructure that works, that is usable. And there are going to be examples of countries that do particularly well across Eurasia, precisely because they adopt good standards, they are trusted for private sector investment, and hopefully will be beacons that others will see.
Okay. So can I bring you in here? Because I believe the AIIB's done a project, or is financing a project in Bangladesh. But there's clearly a message here. There's a role for AIIB and other multilateral development banks where there's a great human need for infrastructure, but there's not an appetite to go into those countries because of all the policy issues and other issues that have been described.
Right. I don't have much to add actually on this one, except to say we've been involved in financing so far 2 projects in Bangladesh. We have a pipeline in that country. We're working on projects in Sri Lanka as well, and it's precisely in countries like that where the AIIB and other multilaterals can bring a significant benefit, not just on a project-by-project basis, but in the wider way that the panel has observed. And in fact, looking at South Asia as a whole, that is a very big market for the AIIB. India is our largest borrower so far. We have a number of projects in Pakistan as well. And over time, I'm sure in all of those countries, we'll be building our presence and building our portfolio, and hopefully through doing so, enabling others to get involved. I think the point David made at the end is also quite an important one, though, about the power of example for governments to see how other developments have taken place. He mentioned China, rightly so. I think many countries have seen China's experience and want to see how they can follow that. But there are many other good examples too. You can look at the remarkable economic transition in Korea, in South Korea, from the Korean War to today, led by infrastructure and other kinds of development, supported by many partners around the world. But those sorts of examples, I think, are ones that help to give the message some resonance.
Time for one more question before we go. Down back.
Jeremy Grant from PwC. I'm just, apologies if this was asked or addressed earlier on. Perhaps Danny mentioned this, but be interested to know from an AIIB perspective, so this may well be one for a microphone for Danny again, but perhaps also the panel. How will the AIIB work or not work with the ADB as it thinks about the needs in Asia for infrastructure financing and development Obviously, the ADB has already been at this for a long time. There's a degree of overlap, potential cooperation, co-opetition, competition. Be interesting to hear, I think, from the private sector's point of view, what the view is on that.
Let's start with you.
From the AIIB's point of view, the answer is very close cooperation. I mean, already in our first nearly 2 years of operation, we have co-financed projects with the Asian Development Bank, we've co-financed projects with the World Bank and with the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. We're building very deep partnerships with those institutions. I think that, as I was mentioning in my presentation earlier, the scale of the need in terms of the financing gap for infrastructure in Asia is so huge, it dwarfs the resources of all public institutions, be they multilaterals or sovereign governments. That means that cooperation and not competition is and must be the order of the day. We can learn from each other's experiences. We've learned a great deal from the experiences of other institutions over many, many years in terms of how we design and develop our institution to work in the most effective way possible. The relationships are very good, and I think those partnerships will really be absolutely essential for the AIIB and for the other institutions, and more importantly, for our member countries and the people who can benefit from our investments over the coming decades.
Okay. Gregory, you agree?
Yeah, I've got to say the view on the ground is exactly that. There aren't signs of competition. There are signs, certainly, of cooperation, and that's all seen to be beneficial.
You seeing the same thing?
Yeah, I guess maybe I'll go back to the earlier question about Bangladesh and Sri Lanka, which is, I think it's really important that combined we focus capital where it's needed the most. So I think for the challenge for the multi-development banks and AIIB is how do we mobilize into the most difficult places, rather than everyone looking at the same infrastructure project in a relatively easy country that's a bit, the commercial banking can do. And so I think Danny's talked about this crowding in. I think that's a really critical theme, which is let's get the commercial sector working on what they can do, and where it's more difficult, let's focus the MDB firepower there.
Yeah, no, I'd agree. It's about filling that gap and about additionality. I remember was the sort of buzzword a while back. How do any new organisation setting up? How do they prove to themselves and others that they are getting projects off the ground that wouldn't already have been funded?
Yeah. And David, again, cooperation, not competition. Is that
Absolutely.
what you're seeing?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely seeing. Thank you very much. I'm afraid we're out of time, so we have to leave it there. Thank you very much. I know there are more questions. Hopefully some of the participants can stick around for a cup of coffee afterwards and answer them for you. My thanks to Daniel Hanna from Standard Chartered, to David Sayer, KPMG, Matt Kavanagh from Prudential, Gregory Hodkinson from ARIP, and of course, Sir Danny Alexander. Please join me in thanking our speakers.